know this. China delivered a shock to global markets when it devalued its currency for the second day in a row today. On Tuesday, the People's Bank of China announced that the country will adjust how it manages the renminbi, also known as the yuan, to let that currency be more controlled by market forces. That move comes in the midst of slowed economic growth in China, led by a slowed global economy that has resulted in a decrease in Chinese investments and exports. Yesterday marked the largest one-day move in the yuan since the currency was officially depegged from the U.S. dollar in 2005. And today, the yuan continued its largest plunge in decades. And while commentators and trade hawks in the U.S. are calling this an attempt to increase Chinese imports by devaluing the currency, the reality might be a little more complicated. China has recently been trying to make the yuan an international reserve currency, like the dollar, the euro, or the yen, to cement that country's role as a central economy to global trade and finance. But that's impossible to do if China maintains such tight controls over their domestic economy, including using capital controls and using trillions of dollars in reserve to help stabilize the economy. Because China isn't quite fully communist or fully capitalist right now. They use communist central planning at home to control the domestic market and then participate in the global markets based on that controlled domestic economy. But China wants to be a major player in the world economy, and China has been pushing to have the yuan added to the IMF's basket of currencies that determine special drawing rights. Just last week, the IMF said that the yuan needs to make its currency more freely usable, and yesterday's move works towards that goal. But Beijing said that Tuesday's move would be a one-off depreciation. So today's devaluation has sparked concerns that this is not a correction, but rather the first stage of a global currency war. It's a complicated situation that isn't helped by the fact that economists worldwide wonder whether Beijing has been inflating its growth numbers this year. So what's going on here? And what can we expect going forward as China tries to strengthen its domestic economy while strengthening the yuan's role as a major currency for global trade and finance? Here now to discuss the dramatic change in how China values its currency and what that means for global markets are Max Fraud-Wolf, economist and professor for the Milano Graduate Program in International Affairs at New School University, and Elaine Zuckerman, economist and president of Gender Action. And Max and Elaine, it's great to have you both with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Max, if I could start with you, what was your first thought when the yuan was initially devalued for the second time today? I read a couple of op-eds over on the Financial Times. One was speculating that there's actual panic going on among the financial elites in China. That do you think it's that bad?
No, I'm not so sure about the panic theory, but it was a sort of double take. I double take on Tuesday and a double take on Wednesday, making it a bit of a double take or quadruple take. I do think the timing is a bit strange and certainly doesn't do much to allay some concerns about whether or not the deceleration of growth, still to an enviable 5% at minimum, even in the most pessimistic of outside targets and 7% on the official side, is maybe a bit more severe than we had been led to believe. And also the big issue here is what kind of responses might we get from a world already nervous, already struggling with global deceleration, that's seeing what's coming pretty close to beggar thy neighbor policy emanating from the second largest economy in the world and the most recent decade's engine of global economic growth.
Yeah. Elaine, Max mentioned beggar thy neighbor policies. There's a lot of debate about whether this is an effort to further improve the value equation for Chinese exports. In other words, Chinese exports just became roughly 4% cheaper this week. So, that should be a boost to their exports. Or if this is a response to internal problems, the housing market is cooling down, their stock market just took an almost 30% hit, and it's apparently only being propped up with government intervention. Or a third and far more benign explanation than either of the first two is that this is an attempt to make the yuan genuinely an international currency responsive to international market conditions so that it can become one of those special drawing rights currencies with the IMF and other international agencies. Your thoughts on those three things, and am I missing something else, and is it all three or what?
Yeah, I would definitely put a lot of emphasis on the latter, because if you look at the history of the UN, which was a controlled currency for so many years until very recently, and is still, as you mentioned in your introduction, to some extent controlled, China being a part market, part socialist economy. Actually, personally, I believe it's a very capitalist economy. But China has been very eager to float the renminbi in a much more global way than it has so far, since it began doing so just a few years ago in a very cautious way, first through Hong Kong, then a little bit through Malaysia and other Southeast Asian countries, then through London. It really hasn't allowed the renminbi yet to go fully global. And I think that ambition of China's to have the renminbi part of the SDR, the special drawing rights of the IMF, would really signal to Chinese people and the government that China has made it globally in terms of being a financial power. I think that's a huge aspiration, and this may well be, this devaluation of the Chinese renminbi over the last 2 days, may be a significant step in that direction. After all, yesterday, the IMF said they welcome this. The IMF feels that China's currency, in fact, has not been undervalued as most Americans and many other people of other countries in the world have claimed over recent years, because China's economy has grown so much and China has become such a major economic world power. But China doesn't feel like it will have made it until it becomes a part of that IMF SDR basket. That is very, very significant. Now, clearly, devaluing any currency is going to make exports cheaper.
Right.
And, you know, I see that as actually slightly more secondary, because China is very slowly growing internal consumption in.
But there's still a largely export-driven economy.
It's still a largely export-driven economy, for sure.
So this would have a hit on their economy.
So it will have a favorable.
Yeah.
Bounce.
Max, your thoughts on my question and Elaine's response, and also let's start with that, actually.
Yeah, so I'm inclined to believe that the SDR, special drawing rights inclusion, being the fifth currency, which by GDP weight or global contribution to growth or population or economic census, they deserve more than most of the folks in the SDR bundle, which is a little bit outdated perhaps, but that notwithstanding, while they do want to be in there and it is important, I would urge a little more attention to the big targets that people care about, which are exports, output, industrial production, and GDP. And by artificially, or not so artificially, depending on what you think the market would have done had it been allowed to do things, which is a pretty murky corner of the universe to find oneself debating. But that notwithstanding, whatever you think there, having less imports because those goods are artificially more expensive, more exports because those goods are, by recent standard, artificially cheaper, will push up GDP, will push up industrial production, and will push up exports, which are life and death goals, which are under some pressure these days. And my guess is that's every bit as important as the SDR, although I do think that is important too. I would be a little bit nervous about overblowing the extent to which national macroeconomic policy is made to hit an artificial external goal, when China's been big on saying, hey, you know, maybe the IMF is kind of outdated and we're pushing our own institutional alternative structure to it, which has been their main focus of the last few years anyway.
Yeah. So are you both of a consensus that the frequently repeated and almost hysterically repeated mantra that China is beating the world on trade because they manipulate their currency is simply not the case? It sounds like you're both saying that.
That's pretty much been my view for really forever, because I think that it has always been in the interest of the U.S., of Europe, and other major trading partners of China to claim that China's protectionist, China's manipulating its currency. But hey, is there a country in the world that isn't really protectionist?
The United States.
That doesn't really ever manipulate its? I mean,
Maybe
every
we
central
should.
bank steps in sometimes,
Yeah,
you
no,
know.
you're right. You're absolutely right.
Now, the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, has always stepped in maybe more actively than some other central banks in the world. And now it's claiming that it's actually allowing the currency
They're
to
running hands off.
to be more or less fair, to allow the market to determine its value more. Now we'll see, because today was the second day of devaluation. If they do this every day, they will lose all credibility on opening up finances to the market.
Right. Max, we have just 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Sure. I would just say that we have not seen this country go to a floating currency. This is still a highly managed, dirty float, and those are common, that's true. But there is a big deal to where you fall on the gray scale, and this is a little bit darker on the gray scale. I would still ask the question of the timing in terms of the intervention here. I don't think that the Chinese are guilty of a lot of the things they're accused of.
Yeah, okay.
But it's
Max,
a cause for concern.
Max and Elaine, it's great to have you both with us. Thank you for a very informative conversation.